In this next video, in my series on percentages, we're going to be looking at calculating percentage increase and decrease. Now, a real-life example of this might be when you are making a sale in a shop and things are discounted by maybe 15% or 25%, or maybe prices are rising due to inflation. Let's take an example. Let's say we've got a TV that costs £120 and is going to have a 10% increase. Now, there are two methods to doing this, one with a calculator, one without. I'm going to show you both the methods. The first method with the calculator is really easy. What we do is we think about the fact that we are increasing by 10%. So if it starts off at 100%, because 100% is just a whole, and I add on 10%, that gives me 110%. Now 110% as a decimal is 1.1. Remember, you just divide by 100. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my amount, which is £120, and I'm going to times it by 1.1. Not 1.2, sorry, 1.1. So I get my calculator, I do 120 times 1.1, and I'm left with £132. Now that's with a calculator. It's very, very easy. Without a calculator, for this type of question, again, quite easy, we're going to just find 10% to start with. So 10% of 120, we divide by 10, that gives me £12. And I can now just add that on to the initial amount. 120 plus 12 is 132. So either method works absolutely fine. Obviously, if you have a calculator, it's much quicker just to work out the decimal and then multiply or divide. It can be more complicated when you don't have a calculator and you're trying to work out not nice percentages. Let's take another example of a percentage increase. Let's say I've got a radio costing £85, and this time we're going to have a 15% increase. Now, just the same as before, on a calculator, 100 plus 15, 115. Divided by 100, that means my decimal is 1.15. When we're doing percentage increase, it's really easy, because if I'm increasing by 27%, I times by 1.27. If I'm increasing by 97%, I would times by 1.97. Very easy. So I do 85 times 1.15 on my calculator, and that gives me 97.75. Without a calculator, find 10%, find 1%, so 10% is 8.5, 1% would be 0.85, and then what we're going to do is we're going to find 5%, so I just times my 1% by 5, or I could take my 10% and divide it by 2, and I would get 4.25. 15% will therefore be 10% plus 5%. If I add these two together, that would give me 15%, which would be 12.75. And just like before, I can do £85 plus 12.75, and that will give me the same answer, 97.75. Let's have one final example, this time where we're doing a little bit more complicated. Let's take £50, and we're going to increase by 38%. With a calculator, 38% increase, 1.38. So I do 50 times 1.38. I get my calculator, 50 times 1.38 is £69. Without a calculator, find 10%. So 10% divided by 10, 5. Find 1%. That would be divide by 10 again, so 0.5. We need to find 30%. So I times it by 3, and that gives me 15. And I need to find 8%, which would be 4, because I times 1% by 8. 0.5 times 8 is 4. Add these two together to get 38%. That would be 19. And then finally, if I add 50 plus 19, that would give me an increase of 38%, which is therefore £69. Let's do exactly the same thing for percentage decrease. Now, a percentage decrease might be like a sale. Let's say that I've got a pair of shoes that cost £150, but they are in a sale of 25%. Well, 25%, if I'm taking that away from 100%, I'm left with 75%. Before the sale, it's worth 100%. After the sale, it's worth 75%. So that as a decimal is 0.75. So all I need to do is get my calculator and do 150 times 0.75, which would be 112.5 pounds. Without a calculator, you need to find 25% and subtract it. Now, obviously, 25% is just a quarter, so if I spot it, I can do 150 divided by 4. Divide by 4 in your head, divide by 2, 75, divide by 2 again, 37.5. But if you don't spot it, you can again find 10%, which would be 15. So 20% is 30, 5% is 7.5. So we can add those together, 20 plus 5, giving me 25%, being 37.5. Now, because it's a decrease and not an increase, you're subtracting it. So I do 150 minus 37.5. And again, that will give me the same answer. With a calculator, it's much, much easier. Without a calculator, not too bad. We can just find 10%, 1%, and kind of go from there. So that's how you go about finding percentage increase and decrease. With a calculator, find the decimal. So if you're doing a percentage increase, you add it to 100%. If you're doing a percentage decrease, you minus it from 100%, and then you convert to a decimal. If you're not, and you're doing just it by hand, then you can do 10%, 1%, multiply, just like before when we were doing percentage of amounts, and then add or subtract as appropriate.